Hello everyone who's joining. Just open the waiting room so everyone is coming in. Hopefully you'll find yourselves on mute. If you're not, I'll just ask you to pop yourselves on mute so that we don't all hear each other and what's going on in our own houses and offices. And I'm sure people will trickle in over the next 5 minutes. We're expecting a few more people on this session today. But as I let more people in, we can get started. So hello everyone, and welcome to this Church Urban Fund or CUF webinar this morning. So if you're here for the Starting from Strength, Asset-Based Community Development for Churches session, you are in the right place. So if we haven't met before, my name is Amy. Sorry, I'm trying to let people in the waiting room at the same time as talking to you. And I'm very pleased to say that we're joined this morning by Barret, who is extremely well placed to speak to us this morning about this topic. So Al has been a vicar in the parish of Hodge Hill in East Birmingham since 2010, I believe. Sorry, letting more people in. His PhD looked at developing a radically receptive political theology in the urban margins, and he co-wrote a book called Being Interrupted, Reimagining the Church's Mission from the Outside In. So Al's worked with us at CUF, Church Urban Fund, over the years to help root our work in asset-based community development, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what he's going to share with us today. So before we get started, just a little bit of housekeeping for us. So this session is being recorded, as you'll see, but don't worry, your faces won't be visible on the recording. And we'll send that recording around to you afterwards, and we'll also put it on our website so you can direct other people who aren't able to be here today to that recording and they can watch it back. And we're also going to have a bit of time at the end of today's session for Q&A. So please do send your questions as we go along, as they come into your head. And you can do that through the Q&A box, which you might have used before and should be visible somewhere on your screen. Might be on the top bar, might be on the bottom, but it should say Q&A somewhere. If you can't find it, that's fine. The chat might be a bit easier to find, so do just drop them in there and I'll pick them all up as we go along. And that's it for housekeeping. So Al, I'll hand over to you now to get started.
Thanks, Amy, and good morning, everybody. It's lovely to be with you. Slightly weird environment where I can't see any of you, so I'm kind of speaking into a vacuum, but I'm imagining that you're there, and hopefully we can have a bit of a conversation at the other end of this hour. I want to start with a story, and it's a story that comes from West Africa via Ireland, via Wolverhampton, I think, to me, and I'm sharing it with you today. It's about a village that was hit by a crisis. And the elders of the village got together and they wondered what they were going to do. And they realized that what they needed to do was go and ask the wise woman to help them. And so a delegation of elders went to talk to the wise woman and asked her to come and help the village. The wise woman agreed, and she told them to go and gather the whole village together under the big tree. And so the elders rushed back to the village, got the whole village together under the big tree, and the wise woman came to address them. "I'm not going to tell you anything you don't already know," she said. "Do you know what I'm going to tell you?" And one by one, the puzzled villagers scratched their heads and admitted, no, we don't know. That's why we asked you to come and help us." "Well," said the wise woman, "I'm afraid I can't help you." And she went away. This was not how this was supposed to go. And so the elders get together again and work out what to do. And they decide to persist and try a second time to ask the wise woman to help them. So again, a delegation goes to see the wise woman in her hut outside the village. And again, she agrees to come and help. And so again, they gather the whole village together under the big tree. And the wise woman comes, and again she says, "I'm not going to tell you anything you don't already know. Do you know what I'm going to tell you?" Now, this time, the villagers are pretty sure the answer's still no, but they've had a stern talking to by the elders. "This time, give her the right answer," they said. So one by one, slightly sheepishly, they say, "Oh, yes, yeah, we do know." And the wise woman says, well, in that case, you don't need my help. And she goes away again. By this time, the elders are getting really frustrated and have torn out what remains of any hair they might have had on their heads, until one of them comes up with a cunning plan. And so the delegation of elders goes back to the wise woman, a third time beg her to come and help them. And the elder with the cunning plan, goes and briefs the villagers very thoroughly. And so a third time, the wise woman comes to speak to the village under the big tree. And for a third time, she says, I'm not going to tell you anything you don't already know. Do you know what I'm going to tell you? And this time, the thoroughly briefed villagers, half of them say no, and the other half say yes. And the wise woman pauses and she smiles. And then she says, well, in that case, listen to each other. And she goes away and is never seen again. So I wonder, just take a moment, what wisdom do you hear in that story? What wisdom do you hear in that story? There are a whole number of things that I could offer you as ideas, wisdom, suggestions, wonderings from that story, but I'm going to limit it to just a couple for the moment. One is that I'm not the wise woman, and I'm not here to tell you things that you already know. Sorry, I'm not here to tell you things that you don't already know. This is about drawing on the wisdom of your rooted place, of your community, of things that you probably know instinctively already. And that may be the only thing that I'm going to offer you today, if you haven't come across it before, is a framework for thinking about those things that you do instinctively and maybe naming them and doing them a bit more intentionally. The other thing I want to offer you is a reflection on what we do when we find ourselves in crisis. And some wisdom from Nigeria, from the thinker Bayoko Malafe, who asks the question, what if the way we respond to the crisis is part of the crisis? What if the way we respond to the crisis is part of the crisis? And as we set the scene for this work this morning, I want to suggest that some of the ways in which the church, and particularly the Church of England, which I know best, some of the ways in which the church responds to the sense of crisis that we are in may in fact be part of the crisis themselves, may actually exacerbate some of the issues that we have. And so what I want to describe is what Ruth and I in our book Being Interrupted call 3 missional economies. They're ways of shaping our imaginations that also shape what we pay attention to. They shape what we worry about. They shape what we value. And they shape the way we interact with each other and with our neighbours. They're powerful, but often they're not necessarily named as such. These are going to be caricatures. Each of them has some truth in it. Hopefully, each of them will resonate with your experience to some extent, but they're not subtle, complex pictures of the real life of churches. They just point to some of the dynamics that maybe we find ourselves in. So here's the first. We call it economy number 1, counting in. And in this economy, in this way of shaping our missional imaginations, what we value most is what we can count. What we value most is what we can count into church. And that tends to be 2 things. It tends to be people, those who attend in some form, and money, the things that we can count at the end of the month or at the end of the financial year in our accounts. And notice what this does. It values people for their ability to fill our pews or fill our groups and activities. And it values people for their ability to give us money, to contribute to church funds. And I want to suggest that this economy is rooted in a fundamental anxiety. It's rooted in an anxiety that there's a hole, a gaping hole at the heart of church that needs filling. And so when we Christians go out from church into our neighborhoods, we're looking at our neighbors primarily at ways of filling that hole. Now, I said this as a crude caricature, and of course there are ifs and buts and whatever with it. And I'm not saying this economy is entirely bad and should be avoided. There's kind of a necessity to it, but it names something important, I think, about the dynamics that drive us, some of the anxieties that lurk underneath, and crucially, the way we see our neighbours. So that's economy number one. And before I introduce economy number two, I want to just tell you a little bit about where I am and my context. So this is Hodge Hill parish on the eastern edge of Birmingham, just under the concrete pillars of the M6 motorway as it wends its way from Spaghetti Junction past Fort Dunlop towards Birmingham Airport. It's a parish of about 19,500 people, and the Church Urban Fund Index of Deprivation will show us that it is one of the most deprived parishes in the country. That is one way of telling the story about our neighbourhood. I find really helpful when we're thinking about deprivation and poverty to use the Church Urban Fund Web of Poverty that was produced a few years ago, which names it not just in terms of income and wealth or lack of, but in all kinds of poverty of resources, but also in what it names as poverty of relationships, and critically also what it calls poverty of identity. Now, the Web of Poverty tends to talk about identity in individual terms. It's around lack of self-worth, lack of well-being, poor mental health, drug or alcohol misuse, perhaps. But I want us to think also about what poverty of identity might look like on a neighborhood level, in a communal sense. And here's a couple of headlines from some years ago now, labeling neighborhoods like mine, which possibly resonate with the kind of words that are used of neighborhoods like yours as well. Work shy, broken ghettos, and the like. And the thing about this language and the way the language is used in the media and by politicians over the years is that people in neighborhoods like mine hear that language and internalize it. They begin to believe that it's about them. And that communal sense of poverty of identity then affects individual senses of identity and well-being and self-worth. And so this stuff is not just about working with neighbours as individuals. It's about working with the stories of our neighbourhoods as well. That's a bit of a preamble from my context to economy number two, which we call giving out. The contrast with counting in. Some of the arrows go in the opposite direction. And so in this economy, rather than concentrating on what comes into church, the focus very much is on what goes out from church. People go out from church into our neighborhoods. Love and service and energy and care and kindness and generosity and all of those wonderful things flow out of church in this economy into our neighborhoods. And sometimes they need a bit of money going with them as well. And in this economy, the story of our neighborhood is one of deprivation, of lack, of poverty, of what our neighbors don't have and what our neighborhoods don't have. In a sense, the gaping hole, the anxiety that was at the heart of the church in the first economy of counting in, gets shifted in this economy into our neighborhood. The gaping hole is among and in our neighbors. We're focused on what they don't have, on what they lack, on the problems of this place, of the resources that aren't there. And so in this economy, the sense that something flows out of church into our neighborhood is a sense that we Christians have something that our neighbors lack, that we need to take to them and give them to fill the hole. Often we'll speak in the language of service. Sometimes we'll talk about provision. The frame of preaching the gospel often fits within this kind of imagination, because what we're doing is we're taking the gospel that we have to our neighbors who don't have it. But all of those ways of thinking and interacting with our neighbors fundamentally configure that relationship with our neighbors as one of them lacking and us having, of us having something to give to them. And just as the relationship in economy one was skewed, notice what that does to the way we perceive our neighbors. One way of getting a bit deeper into economy number two is by thinking about Jesus's three temptations in the wilderness. You may remember, particularly in Matthew's and Luke's versions of the story, as Jesus spends 40 days and 40 nights in the wilderness, he's tempted by the devil, by Satan, with three things. And there are all kinds of ways of interpreting these temptations, and this is just one, which hopefully illustrates a little bit more of this economy number two. First, the turn stones into bread temptation, we might think as the temptation to the power of the provider. Jesus is being tempted to have almost magical powers of provision. And of course, there is nothing wrong at all with feeding the hungry. If people are hungry, then it is good to feed them. But notice when the power is imbalanced between those of us providing and those on the receiving end, notice what that can do to the relationship. Again, the receivers come with empty hands. We come with fullness, offering that to our neighbors. But it can be quite seductive. Actually, we can go away from our session at the food bank feeling a bit better about ourselves because we fed lots of hungry people. And over time, insidiously, something really quite distorted, quite twisted can begin to happen. We can begin to look forward to our shifts at the food bank and hope there'll be lots of people coming through the door so that we can feed them, and kind of just indirectly feel a little better about ourselves and about church because we're doing something useful. Which would mean logically that if no one came through the doors of the food bank one day, we might feel a little bit disappointed. We might feel a bit sad. We might feel like we're missing the buzz of being the providers. Now, of course, food banks are much more rich and complex than that. And again, it's a caricature. But I hope you see something of that temptation into the power of the provider. The second one, the jump off the temple and the angels will catch you temptation, we might think of as the power of the performer. Sometimes we Christians want to be seen to be doing something good. It improves the stories that people tell about us. It improves the perceptions of our neighbors of who we are. And of course, being perceived as doing good is not a bad thing in itself. But again, it can subtly become seductive We can want to be seen to be doing something good. We can be wanting to be keen to demonstrate our impact to our neighbours, to the wider world, and often, yes, to funders too. And lastly, the temptation of Jesus to bow down before the tempter, before Satan, and to be given power over all things in the world, all lands and all peoples. We might think of as the power of the possessor. And again, this can be shown in subtle ways. We can imagine that we are good at running stuff, that when we run stuff, it goes well, it's safe, it's good for people. And it may well often be the case. But just notice again what happens to our relationships when we are the ones that control the space. We welcome people in, but on our terms. We welcome people in, but we're in charge. We welcome people in as consumers, as participants, but actually we're the people that pull the strings. We're the people that own the table that others sit around. There can be some real temptations in that, again, to skew the relationships with our neighbours when we imagine that we are in control. So some of the dangers of economy number 2. You will be relieved and probably not totally surprised to hear that there's an economy number 3. But I'm not going to suggest that this is the absolute kind of panacea that solves all the challenges and anxieties of the church and all the ways in which our relationships with our neighbours are deformed. I do want to suggest, however, that it's a helpful corrective to sit alongside economies number 1 and 2. And we want to call this economy being interrupted or treasure seeking or both. In this economy, in this third economy, instead of being anxious about a gaping hole at the heart of our neighborhoods, we reimagine our neighbors and our neighborhoods as places and people of abundance, of gifts that God has given in this place and to these people. And we go out of church looking for that treasure, looking for those gifts and rejoicing in it and celebrating it. But the going out is not the only dynamic in this economy, because something comes back as well. When we go out into our neighborhoods looking for treasure in our neighbors and in our neighborhoods, we discover that we receive something too. It might not be the things that we're conventionally used to counting. It might well be all kinds of other kinds of gifts, skills, wisdom, stories, passions, knowledge, experience. It might be things that people want to share with each other. It might even be questions and challenges for us as Christians that might interrupt some of our agendas and invite us and disrupt us and discomfort us into doing things differently, into seeing things differently. But this third economy is an opportunity to let go of some of those anxieties that drive a lot of the way we often interact with our neighbours, whether it's about filling the holes in church or filling the holes in our neighbourhood. It's an invitation into a different way of imagining the world and our neighbours. I'm going to pause there, because in a few moments, we're going to come back and think about some of the building blocks and principles and practices that might go with that third economy. But for 5 minutes, I'm going to invite Amy to put you into breakout rooms to have a conversation together about what you've just heard and seen. And the simplest question for you is, what's stirring for you as you heard and saw ways of describing those first 2 economies and then the third economy? What stirred for you in terms of thoughts? What stirred for you in terms of feelings? What did you notice? What does it make you wonder? And we're going to invite you when you come back to share in the Q&A some of those thoughts and wonderings that might help us have a bit of a conversation at the other end of the morning. But 5 minutes in breakout rooms together. What do you notice? What do you wonder? What's stirring for you? So, how does economy number 3 work in practice? One of the things about asset-based community development as an approach to engaging with our neighbourhoods and with our neighbours, one of the things that's crucial is that when we know what we're looking for, or when we're open to looking for particular kinds of things in our neighbourhoods, then we will find them. One of the key elements of ABCD as an approach is naming different kinds of asset or gift that we might find in our neighbourhoods. And I want to name them for you now and just do a little bit of explanation of each one. It starts, perhaps most crucially, with the passions, the knowledge, the skills and gifts of our neighbours. As I said in my introduction to economy number 3 earlier, our neighbours are gifted with all kinds of gifts that are very, very unrelated to how much money they have in their pockets. They may know stuff. They may have huge amounts of life experience that they can share with others. They may know how to do stuff. They may have all kinds of skills that aren't necessarily the ones that we immediately think that we might need. They may have things that they're passionate about, that they care about, that keep them awake at night and get them up in the morning, that make them tick. That again might not be the things that we're passionate about or that are at the heart of our agenda. And so at the heart of this approach is encountering our neighbours with an openness to discover what they care about, what they know about, what they can do, and what, given the opportunity, they might want to share with other neighbours and with us. Association sounds quite a formal term. It may spark thoughts of groups that have minutes and agendas and constitutions, but actually we're talking about something much more messy here. We're talking about all the ways in which neighbours come together in our communities. Some of those will be clubs and formal kinds of association, but many of them will be much more informal than that. The dog walkers that bump into each other in the park, the parents and carers that hang around the school gate waiting for their kids at the end of the day. Those informal gatherings are absolutely crucial in terms of weaving the web of community in our neighbourhoods. And so let's notice where they are in our places. Institutions, of which the church may well count as one, are of course important and a kind of an asset and a gift to community, but only if they see themselves as treasure chests to be opened rather than fortresses to be defended. Many of you will have had experience of engaging with schools in your neighbourhood. And maybe you might have a mixed experience of the school that is easy to walk in the door and arrange an appointment with the person that you want to see and have a conversation, and the school that's much more difficult to get anywhere past the reception desk. How institutions offer their gifts and their resources to a neighbourhood can vary wildly. The places and spaces themselves. I live in an urban neighbourhood, but it nevertheless has all kinds of little green corners and green corridors and green triangles. Spaces where wildlife thrives and grows, spaces where people can breathe and rest and enjoy and delight in their surroundings. But it's not just green spaces that can be resources or assets or gifts in this sense. Some of the more grey and concrete spaces in our neighbourhood can nevertheless be turned into places of encounter, can nevertheless be huge resources for the neighbourhood. When we talk about local economies, we don't just mean about where money is exchanged, although that's part of it, and certainly money that is paid to people who babysit and people who mow lawns is just as important as those more sort of formal economies of exchange. But likewise, the exchange of skills and time and things are critical. Just imagine what would happen if a street decided that not every house needed a lawnmower, and actually you probably needed one for the street that you could share with your neighbours. How would that transform the amount of money that all of us spend on these devices, and even the economy of sharing that would grow up around it? The stories of people's lives, the story of the community itself, are another kind of gift to be unlocked and discovered and shared. And lastly, the traditions of a community. It might be an ancient, centuries old tradition of well dressing or maypole dancing, or it might be a very new tradition. In our community, we have a theatre group that puts on a Christmas panto every year. It's been going for about 12 years now, but it's become a foundational cornerstone tradition of our neighbourhood. So when we look at our neighbourhoods as places of God-given abundance, what kinds of gifts might we discover? What kinds of treasure might we unearth there? If we go in with a bit of a guide, like this one here, we might discover all kinds of things we never knew were there or imagined. So that's one key building block for an ABCD approach. Another is what we locally here call connectors. These are people that do it naturally. They live and breathe connecting. They are passionate about the well-being of the community. They're well connected and they're trusted. They're the kind of people that you cross the road naturally to talk to, rather than the people you cross the road naturally to avoid. Connectors, as the name suggests, are people that are brilliant at making connections, at bringing people together, at knowing what somebody's gifts are and what someone else's needs are, and how to join the two together to forge a new friendship and a mutual exchange. Connectors are the kind of people that are motivated to connect more and to build community. They love to listen more than talk. They're gifted at making people feel welcome. They can spot gifts and skills and passions in others, and they believe in people in a profoundly inclusive way. I wonder, if you ponder for a moment, I wonder who the connectors in your neighbourhood might be. Who are the ones you know already? And who are the ones which, if you went out with different eyes, you might discover? And a third element of this little collection of building blocks for an ABCD approach is what we call bumping spaces. Going back to the park where the dog walkers bump into each other and the school gate where the parents and carers bump into each other at the end of the day, where are the spaces in your neighbourhood where people bump into each other? They may be outdoor spaces, they may be indoor spaces, they might be the queue at the shop, they might be the hairdresser or the bookies, they might be the library, they might be the post office queue. They might be, of course, the places that are already set up to be bumping spaces, like community centres and even churches. Although sometimes we imagine that the bumping and encounter only happens in those spaces. And actually part of this is seeing that it happens all over the place in a much wider sense. And so bumping spaces might just be about finding them. Where do they happen already? It's certainly about hanging out in them and inhabiting them, because we too become part of the bumping, the encounter. They're the places where we'll have the best conversations. But it might also be something a bit more proactive about nurturing spaces that have potential to be good, rich bumping spaces, but just need a bit of extra encouragement. For many years in the school playground at the end of the day, we noticed that lots of parents and carers would hang around waiting for their kids, but not necessarily talk to each other. Particularly, I might note the men. Um, what we did very simply was just set up a table and started serving squash and tea and coffee and biscuits. And it's amazing suddenly the way people started connecting with each other and started talking to each other, having conversations, discovering more about each other, simply just because we'd added a little extra ingredient into the mix. And of course, sometimes we might want to create bumping spaces where there haven't been before. In this picture, you can see two of the ones we've created, one indoors in a shop front youth and community centre on the estate, and another outdoors in a much more pop-up kind of way, grabbing a little bit of green space and sticking a gazebo and some tables up and inviting neighbours to come together to eat and talk and play with each other. So we have 7 ingredients for an abundant community that we might look for as the treasure that we're seeking. We have the connectors that are crucial in finding those treasures and connecting them together. We have the bumping spaces that we might find and inhabit and nurture and create where a lot of this connecting work happens. But how do we start processes like this? Well, it may be that you're already engaged in this kind of work and it's just happening naturally. Or it may be that you're longing to do it, but haven't quite found a way in yet. Or it may be that you want to convince more of your congregation that this is a good way of doing mission, a good way of engaging with your neighbours, and some of them are a bit skeptical on it. Well, very briefly, before we go into a Q&A to end, I want to just offer you a few touchstones for how changing the culture slowly at the speed of trust in your communities might possibly happen. One is that there might be moments, precipitating moments, where something shifts, and it's about grabbing those moments and seizing the opportunities. In our neighbourhood, it was one of those moments was when the wonderful purpose-built St Philip and St James Church Centre, with all kinds of breakout rooms and community spaces, a very busy, actively used building, was condemned for demolition. And in that moment, our church community had to ask the question, well, how do we do church now? How do we engage with our neighbours now? And we had to find a different way. And the different way was mapping our neighbourhoods and hanging out in some of those bumping spaces and having conversations and seeing what we unearthed. And so a second element of this culture change is intentional practices and processes that can help it. And with that, ways of finding support from outside or inside, support and mentoring and companionship. And one of the ways that you may well have come across already is the Church Urban Fund resource, Know Your Church, Know Your Neighbourhood, which is one kind of gently structured approach of getting to know your neighbourhood better, of beginning some of those conversations, of unearthing some of the treasure, and also having people to journey with you along the way to help you as you do your noticing and wondering. We did a bit of mapping of our neighbourhoods some 14 years ago now, after the building was shut. And we discovered all kinds of spaces within it that we wanted to hang out in. But we also need key people, local leaders, connectors, animators. And this wonderful little diagram just names some of those qualities in the kind of leader that will help drive this kind of work. I'll just leave that on the screen for a moment so that you can have a look at it. And needless to say, at this point, all of these slides will be available afterwards, and Amy will be able to share them with you. And lastly, culture change is about a change of the imagination. We need resources for telling a different story about our neighbourhoods, to move on from that poverty of identity that's been imposed on many of our neighborhoods by those external forces that want to tell a negative story about us. How can we shift that story to one that talks of the abundance of this place? How can we shift the stories that we tell in church about our neighbours and our neighbourhoods? Well, one way we've done it here a few times over the years is to put on a big event that we call Hodge Hill Unsung Heroes, where we invite people to nominate their neighbours who have made a difference in their communities and celebrating them and telling some of their stories and connecting people together through that. And another way we've discovered over the years, as I mentioned, our local theatre group that emerged from our first Hodge Hill Unsung Heroes event, our theatre group has become a place where fun stories are told, where stories of passion and of tears are told, where stories are enacted in our neighbourhood, including, you might note here, the story of Jesus's passion. And in the midst of that coming together of storytelling of the stories of the gospel and the stories of our neighbourhood, something begins to shift. We begin to look for signs of resurrection in our neighborhood, as well as the signs of crucifixion. And finally, I want to come back to that story of Jesus's temptation in the wilderness, because you'll remember, if you know that story, that after the temptations, after the 40 days and 40 nights of Jesus dwelling in that place of dryness, of wilderness, angels come and minister to him. Jesus resists the temptation to the power of the provider, the performer, and the possessor. And after that resistance, he finds himself on the receiving end of the gifts of unexpected others. I wonder who our angels in our communities might be, who we have received unexpected gifts from. I wonder where we might discover the angels in our community. And lastly, to fire our imaginations again before we have a brief Q&A. Remember the story of the feeding of the 5,000. It starts with profound anxiety among the disciples. There are lots of hungry people here. What are we going to do? We don't have the money to feed all of them. And what does Jesus say? He says, what do you have? Go and see. And he sends his disciples back into the crowds with new eyes, looking for something that maybe they weren't looking for before. And it turns out that in the crowds, there is enough to bring to Jesus, enough to give thanks for, enough to discover is enough to feed all with baskets left over. God's abundance discovered in our midst. This is where I stop talking, and where we pick up some Q&A. So we have about 8 minutes left, and I wonder, Amy, I'm looking for you.
Hello, I'm here.
Hi. Have you had a chance to notice some of the questions and wonderings in the
Yes, so I've picked
chat?
up a few that I think are more questions that people were wondering after the breakout.
Yeah.
So the first of those is someone wondering how best to avoid being perceived as just parachuting in with solutions.
Thank you. I mean, I think the simple answer to that is to not parachute in with solutions. Sorry if that feels like it's stating the obvious. This stuff takes time. This stuff primarily is about building relationships. It's about getting to know our neighbours and not having any other agenda beyond that. It's about going into our communities looking for the abundance that's there rather than imagining that we're bringing the answers into it. And so I guess one of the things that I want to encourage you in is patience. Patience doesn't work on 3-year funding cycles. but patience does work in the long story of being church. And this is slow work. This is moving at the speed of trust.
Wonderful, thank you, Al. The next two questions I picked out are similar, so I'll read them both. Someone was wondering about how we also ensure that we celebrate and encourage without falling into the seduction of power and pride. And someone else, or it might well be the same person, wondering how to encourage changing the narrative to economy 3 while still encouraging the people on the ground who are working so hard.
I think the key word in those is celebration. There are, of course, plenty of people on the ground working really hard, and we need to celebrate them. But if we can find ways of doing that alongside celebrating some of the unsung heroes, some of the people that maybe are not in the obvious roles of caring and serving, if we can find ways of unearthing new gifts and celebrating those in our communities, if we can find spaces that belong to all of us together, where people from different locations in our neighborhoods and different backgrounds can come together to celebrate each other and tell some of those stories, then I think we're on to something that is different to being stuck in those first two economies. So yeah, celebrate away. Find ways of having fun with your neighbors that aren't dependent on you being the provider all the time. Find ways of inhabiting spaces that aren't dependent on you being host all of the time. Because your neighbors will have all kinds of wisdom to offer you on how celebration happens in your neighborhood, that it may be that sometimes the church has been on the edges of rather than in the middle of.
Thank you. And another question, this person was wondering, how do we measure? Do we measure?
That is a very good question. And over the years, at times, I've wanted to resist measuring anything. But sometimes measuring is helpful. And obviously, it's really crucial what it is we're measuring and also how we are measuring it. So, in our work here over the years, some of the things that we've wanted to measure sometimes have been whether our neighbours feel more connected, whether our neighbours feel like they have more people to turn to for help, whether our neighbours are feeling more confident to share their passions, gifts, and skills with each other. There's some of the things that we've wanted to measure at times here, and the way that we've had to measure those things and the way we've wanted to measure those things is by asking our neighbours, by letting them take the lead in telling the stories of what has changed in our community, rather than either us as those kind of doing some of the action and then evaluating it, or inviting those from outside to kind of give the final judgment on whether this community has changed and how we prove that. Asking our neighbours themselves. And stories of change are just as powerful, I think, as numbers that indicate change, both and together.
Definitely, thank you. And then I'll make this the last one, so we don't run over. I think this is an interesting one that you might wish to comment on, Al. So this person said that they loved and needed to hear the challenge about seeking treasure and abundance as opposed to possessor. And they're wondering about the tension between carrying responsibility and being safe and accountable with releasing others and embracing their approaches or treasures if they are unorthodox and potentially risky.
Thank you. That is a really important question, and it's one we've wrestled with over the years. And obviously, one of the things about inviting a whole load of strangers to become neighbours and friends to each other is that does come with risk. And those of us who are finely attuned to safeguarding may well have all kinds of warning bells kind of ringing with that. And what we're not doing here is inviting an open space where no safeguarding good practice is done. What I think we are discovering in our neighbourhood over the years is that people are safer the more connections they have. So if someone is connected to only one other person who is offered to be kind and caring and supportive of them, then that's wonderful. But it also comes with a whole load of risk if that relationship has an element of kind of exploiting or abusing or whatever in. If someone is connected to a dozen people, then that risk is dramatically reduced because there's a whole load of people, even if there's one risky relationship there, there's a whole load of other people looking out for that person, being attentive to signs of risk and danger. And those people are networked in to a wider structure that can pick up those concerns about risk and do the appropriate actions with them. So we call it community safeguarding here. It's not an alternative to statutory safeguarding responsibilities, but it's definitely an enriching and expanding of that work.
So all that's left to say is a huge thank you to Al for what was a really fascinating session. There's a lot, I'm sure, for you to all mull over and digest there, perhaps over the next few days. As I mentioned earlier, I will be sending around both the slides and a recording of the session. So if you want to re-watch it and go over some of these things again, you can do that, and you can send it on to others as well. But in the meantime, please don't hesitate to get in touch with me or anyone else at CUF if you have any questions. But otherwise, thank you all for coming and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye, everyone.